Welcome and thank you. So the topic we wanted to explore today that came to me was, is everything predestined? Before we go into this, I think it's important to explore the question first as to what is its relevance before we go into discovering the answer. Because one of the important things when we approach any such question in any field of learning, but especially when it comes to such matters, is that we are not going in with an acquisitive mindset, because that is something we are so conditioned to do when we learn anything, is we want to acquire knowledge. And that same mentality of acquiring something comes into such questions also, and into things such as reading a particular scripture or any such activity, because that is so important for us to be aware of, that we are not here to acquire but to explore. Because when we move away from acquiring into exploring, then we listen differently. We are listening in a meditative way. We are talking in a meditative way. We are not trying to either increase our knowledge or show that knowledge, but actually probe into a living question, so that it becomes a meditation, which then becomes an integral thing to our life. I mean, if we don't have to necessarily close our eyes to do meditation, it can be done in any activity if we approach it with the right attitude. So I think it's important to explore the question. So the question is, any question for that matter, is not to explore it academically even. It is not for some kind of an intellectual curiosity that we need to do that, because there are many who do that, and that really doesn't touch the core of our heart. It may be something that the intellect is interested in, just like any other theory, but that's not what we want to do. We want to actually see if it can touch our heart. And for that, we need to see what is it in my living that connects to this question. And when the reason I even came up with this question was the fact that so much of our life goes based on an assumption that we have a say over things that happen, right? But before that, stepping back, one inescapable truth of our life is that not only that we exist, but also that there is some form of suffering we encounter. Suffering is of many kinds. There is the suffering that comes from nature, including natural disasters and unexpected events, such as now with coronavirus, and many such things, small and big, micro and macro. Then there is the suffering inflicted by others, which is all kinds of suffering that people try to inflict upon each other through words and through sometimes physical violence and so on. And the third is the suffering inflicted by oneself, whether it's bodily suffering of disease and so on, but more importantly, psychological suffering, quote unquote psychological, because that itself is a questionable thing, whether there is such a thing as psyche, but we can, at least for the moment, take it to be psychological suffering, things such as anxiety, depression, anger, and so on. So all of these are truths. Now, we may not every moment feel that there is suffering. We may even at the moment have a pretty good life and think, why are we talking about suffering? But the truth of the matter is that suffering is something that's seen everywhere around us. And if we are honest with ourselves, we see that we do a lot of things that are only an attempt to either mitigate existing suffering or escape from suffering or avoid suffering. So all endeavors, whatever we do, whether it is religious endeavors, spiritual endeavors, whether we identify with a particular cult, a particular political ideology, philosophy, whether it's non-dualism, dualism, or anything in between, whether it is art, music, entertainment, all of these activities and endeavors are our attempt to escape from suffering or to mitigate suffering in some form or the other. So it's important to look into the root of suffering rather than just escape from it or just try to mitigate it through such activities, because that is really the core of religion. Every religious tradition, that's why emphasizes so much on suffering and the means of transcending suffering. So the thing that's very clear is that suffering is always due to resistance, right? I feel that whenever there is resistance, there is suffering. The resistance is always to the impermanence of things. So what we are so conditioned to do is to compare, and through comparison resist what is. So either we compare with another person or compare with another time. So there is comparison in space, which is with other people or other things. And then there is comparison in time, which is comparing yesterday with today or today with tomorrow. And what we can see there is that any comparison is about happenings, right? Life is nothing but a series of happenings. There are things that happened, things that are happening, and things that will happen. And as long as there is any resistance to past, present, or future, whatever happened, whatever is happening, or whatever will happen, there is going to be some resistance, and that resistance is going to cause suffering. So it can be regret over something that happened. It can be an anger over something that happened. It can be a deep dissatisfaction with something that's happening right now, or it can be a tremendous anxiety about something that might happen tomorrow. And through all of this, what we see is that the underlying assumption is that we feel that things can be different from what they are, or what they were, or what they will be. It seems like, and that is the root of comparison, right? It seems like we think there is a possibility that we can do something better to so that we could have avoided what is happening now or what happened already. And therefore, this second guessing of our choices or our actions and of the happenings results in a lot of anxiety, right? And that's basically what it is, because everything is a happening. And no matter what the happening is, when the happening is, to whom the happening is, as long as we resist it in any form, then there is suffering, right? So that resistance is primarily, I feel, because we have a deep-rooted assumption that it could be different. So that is where this question comes, right? Is everything predestined, or is there a possibility of things being different from what they are, or what they were, or what they will be? Now, before we go into this question, there are a few things which we can look into, which are very interesting insights into this question, right? One is that I always wondered about astrology. I've never studied or anything, but I find that there are some good astrologers who are able to fairly accurately predict things. And regardless of whether, regardless of the curiosity factor, which is what drive many people, I think the underlying fact is that the very fact that there is a possibility to predict the future accurately, isn't that interesting? If it is true, now I know that some people may not think astrology is accurate or even a science of any kind, but I think I like I said, I'm not an expert by any means, and I cannot say one way or the other, but I do know people who are very capable and seem to be fairly accurate. So that is an interesting insight to see that there is a way for someone who doesn't even know you, and based on some data like your birth time and place and all that, tell what's going to happen, and it happens. The other interesting thing which a friend of mine told me, and I think this experience has been, I mean, even I've had it once and many have had it, is that sometimes you get a dream of something that's going to happen and it happens exactly as that, right? That again is a very interesting thing. So the very fact that the mind is somehow able to tune into an event that has not yet happened means there is something that seems to be determined already that we are tuning into. So those two are kind of interesting asides, if you will. But I think the core thing is that if we look at it both from an inquiry standpoint and from the standpoint of devotion, we find ourselves coming to the same point, right? So from an inquiry standpoint, we can see that any choice we make is based on what is the knowledge we already have, right? So there is no way for me to be free of my knowledge when I make my choice in any matter, right? So the very fact that any decision of any kind that I make is based on the knowledge that is already there. And the knowledge is already a programming, which is combination of one's genetic inheritance. So there is a bunch of predispositions that everybody has, which makes us go in a particular way with respect to any decision. And second is the environment we are exposed to, which again, we have no choice over, and which predisposes in a certain way. So both due to our nature and due to our nurture, we are programmed in a particular way, and that programming is what acts when we say we act or when we say we decide. So in reality, there is nothing that is free about a choice, because a choice is basically a program running which is based on what is already there, the data that's already there. And if you are exposed to a different set of data, which means if you are exposed to a different environment of growing up as a child, or if you had a different genetic makeup, you would naturally make a different decision. So it seems that every decision that we think we make are actually fairly deterministic based on what is already there. And the other aspect is that if we also look at it as if we see rather that there is an intelligence that's operating at every level, and that intelligence that's operating at the cellular level, at the atomic level, at in every organ, in every body, in all the way up to every galaxy, that intelligence is beyond thought. And that's probably the best way to capture that we call God, right? So even when we say God, from a devotional stance, not a concept that we need to believe in, but we can actually inquire into that and realize that it's not a concept that one needs to put belief in, but it's actually a reality that one can see, which is that there is intelligence operating at every level. And that intelligence is what is operating to make everything function perfectly. If we take our own body, there is so much intelligence there, and even a small single-celled amoeba has so much intelligence, and so on and so forth. So this intelligence is not a product of thought or a product of brain, as many scientists think intelligence is a product of the brain, but the intelligence that created the brain is there before the brain. So that intelligence, if we call God, and if we therefore say that God is omniscient, which is something every one instinctively then realizes, if there is God, if there is this intelligence which we call God, and this intelligence is operating in every cell, and then this God that we call as supreme being is omniscient by definition, because otherwise it cannot be a supreme being. And omniscient means one who knows everything, which is past, present, and future. So even from that standpoint, we can see that if there is an omniscient being that knows the future, that means the future is already written. So this is another way to look at it. Now, one may ask, okay, so someone asked this question to me actually. They said at any point in time, we have to make choices. And these choices range from trivial to profound, and we have to live with the consequence of these choices. So it is hard to live without making choices. So how do I go about making choices and living with the consequences if everything is predestined? And the other question also, which naturally might arise, is if everything is predestined, why bother acting at all, right? So the first question about choice is that the first interesting thing is choice itself is a product of lack of clarity, right? So that's a bit of a, I mean, that's important to be aware of. When I'm very clear about something, I don't make a choice. It's just clear. If I have to go to a particular place and there is a fork in the road, I don't have to think. If I know which way, if I know my destination clearly, I'm just going to go the route I'm going to go, right? So same is true with at every level. I mean, so the very fact that there is lack of clarity, or rather the very fact that there is a choice implies there is lack of clarity. So that's something to be aware of, right? And in fact, there is an interesting Upanishad that a friend recently shared with me, which says that, Taittiriya Upanishad, it says that if you feel there is choice, then don't lean on your knowledge, but go to a wise person who sees the situation clearly and helps you in making the correct decision out of that clarity. Because being choiceless is actually the state of clarity. not making choice, right? That's one thing to be very aware of. Now, that said, we already said, if at all I'm going to make choice, I can, if, either, as I said, I can take the wise counsel of someone who is able to see things clearly, or I rely on the faculties I have. But even when I do that, we already saw that everything that I call my faculties are all preconditioned. So there is that, but that doesn't mean that I'm flippant about it, right? I still make a sincere effort to gain clarity, not to make choice, even actually to gain clarity. If I analyze a situation and through the analysis I gain clarity, then the choice is made automatically, rather than weighing the pros and cons and going through a laborious process. But whatever it is, you make that, you arrive at a decision, and based on that, a set of events unfold. It can be a very trivial choice like what to eat for breakfast, and it can be a very major choice that changes your life for decades. So whatever it is, once you make the choice, you live with the consequences of the choice, right? Now, if I see this clearly, that everything is predestined, therefore the way in which I arrived at my decision, even though it appeared to be an act of free will, is actually a product of conditioning, and therefore it was exactly what it can be, then once it is made, I don't look back. I don't regret it. I don't second guess it. I say that's the best decision that was possible, and I live with the consequences. That's a very free way of going forward. It's in a very simple way, rather than constantly living in anxiety and regret and all the rest that plagues us normally, right? So interestingly, in this connection, I'm reminded of two things. One is that there is an incident in the life of Sri Ramana Maharshi where, in fact, it was the first ever teaching he gave. He came to Tiruvannamalai as a young boy, and he never opened his mouth. He remained silent for many years. And somehow his mother found that he is there, and she came and tried to talk to him. He wouldn't talk. He was in silence. And after a lot of pestering, he wrote something on a piece of paper, which is the first time ever he wrote anything. Maybe it was not even paper. Maybe it was, on a rock or something. I don't remember. But what he wrote is very interesting. He wrote that this is what he said. He said, in accordance with the destiny of each, the one whose function it is to ordain makes each to act. What will not happen will never happen, whatever effort one may put forth. And what will happen will not fail to happen, however one may seek to prevent it. This is certain. Therefore, true wisdom is to be still. So this is what he gave her, and she read it, and she, after that, went back. So the many people do not, I think, ascribe as much importance to this as it ought to be, because this one sentence actually is enough for one to actually probe into and realize the complete absence of an individual self that we imagine there is. Because what he says is, what will happen will never fail to happen, no matter how much we try to stop it. And what will not happen will never happen, no matter how much we try to make it happen. So if this clarity is there, that what has happened and what is happening and what will happen is exactly what had to happen, what had to happen then, now, and later. If this clarity is there, then there is no resistance. And when there is no resistance, that is surrender. That is surrender to life itself. not even surrender to some imaginary concept or ideal, but surrender to life. Every moment, if I am able to live this reality that what is happening and what has already happened and what will happen is exactly, precisely ordained to happen, and it could not be otherwise. That is simply the definition of surrender. So this was a profound two-sentence teaching that he gave in the very beginning as a like 19-year-old boy or something, which is remarkable. And he said, as you can see, he ends by saying, therefore true wisdom is to be still. Be still is not to be inert. It's very important to distinguish the two. Be still is to not have resistance, not have thought movement that is taking us away from what is happening. So there is also a famous biblical statement that even Ramana Maharshi was fond of quoting, that it says, be still and know that I am God. So again, it's got the same import to it, which is that which we call God, this intelligence, if we see it operating every moment, and it is perfect in its operation, because it is not something that happens through any volition. One can see that very clearly in one's own body, right? There is one of the most beautiful things which we somehow ignore is the tremendous intelligence of our own bodies, which we touched upon earlier. When we see the tremendous intelligence in every cell, in every organ, how a bunch of atoms come together to form a cell, a bunch of cells come together to form an organ, a bunch of organs come together to form a system, like a reproductive system or respiratory system or digestive system or whatever. And then all these systems come together to form the body. Now, there is no volition there. It's all happening. And when I even refer to my body as I'm actually referring to this intelligence that I'm not aware of. It's just functioning so precisely. It has always functioned precisely, and it will continue to function precisely. And when there is this event called death, the same atoms will roll over and they would become part of nature, and they would regenerate themselves. So at any point, it's an eternal process. Even at the physical level, we see that is perfect. So that intelligence is what we call God. And that's why this says, when I am still, when I realize that just the way the physical functioning is so perfect, everything else is, thoughts are also perfect in their own way. Whatever thought I need to exercise to go about in life, to function sanely, they are perfect in their own way. I don't need to compare myself. I use the word myself within quotes because we refer to this as long as I have this idea that this body is myself, then this idea of comparing with others comes about. And when I see that the intelligence that's operating through thought, through the intellect, is perfect as it is at the physical level, and it is perfect here as it is there, and all that is operating is this intelligence, then there is no comparison, and there is no sense of an individual self either. So it just seeing that everything is predestined, which is to say that everything is happening precisely and perfectly, makes it clear our own perfection. What is functioning here is perfect. What is functioning there is perfect. And therefore, to realize our own perfection is the essence of all true religion. And that is what that particular phrase of Sri Ramana Maharshi points to. In fact, the other last thing which we can look into is there is a work called Saddarshanam or Ulladu Narpadu, which again Sri Ramana wrote, where he writes a verse on this particular topic. I'll just read the English translation of it. It says, "The debate between free will and fate is only for those who do not know the root of both. Those who have seen that the ego is the common source of free will and fate have passed beyond them both and will not return to them." So let's look into this because it's very interesting. He says the debate between free will and fate is only for those who do not know the root of both. What's the root of both free will and fate? One way to look at it is intent, right? As long as I have an intent towards my actions, then when the result matches the intent, I have this notion that it's my free will, because I seem to have had control over the effect. So I think it's free will. But on the other hand, if the result seems to not match the intent, then I think it's fate, because then I realize that it's beyond my, it was not within the control of my free will, which would have then resulted in my intent materializing, right? So in both cases, interestingly, what is at the root of it is intent. So that is what he points to when he says the root of both, the root of both the idea of free will and the idea of fate or even destiny comes out of intent. And intent is there only when there is a sense of doership, right? When I feel that I am doing the action and I want a particular result out of the action, then there is intent. And that intent again causes this duality of fate and free will. Now we took the example of the body, right? Now just take the same example again. Is there any intent in the physiological functioning of the body? It seems that whether it's the heart or the liver or the brain or the lungs, they are just functioning precisely every moment what they are supposed to do, right? So there is a clue right there as to what is perfection in action, because it goes to the other question that was raised earlier, which is that if everything is predestined, then why should I act at all? That's not even a possibility, right? You know, one can try to remain inactive. It's not even possible. Everything is active. That is the nature of the universe, right? Every cell, every atom, every molecule, everything is active. And therefore, we are all active in our own way. And so it is not to stop activity, but it is to realize that activity happens. I am not the doer of the activity. There is no doer of the activity. It just happens through the same intelligence that makes everything happen. When that clarity is there alone, this question of fate and free will goes away. That's what Sri Ramana points out here by saying both fate and free will have the same root, which is having an intent, which is the self or the individual. When I say self with a small s, individual ego. But when there is no intent, then there is no question of free will. There is no question of even fate. It just happens. We don't have to blame fate. We don't have to take credit of free will. Everything happens as it's meant to happen. It can be called as predestined. That is also true. But it doesn't mean that I take recourse to any concept of fate, just as I don't take recourse to any concept of free will, but I just do what is meant to be done at any given moment with clarity, as we said, you know, to gain clarity in a situation, and then act on the clarity, and then just go with the flow of life, and whatever the consequences are, go with it, taking complete responsibility every moment. So that is the first part. And then he says, those who have seen that the ego is the common source of both free will and fate have passed beyond them both. So that's what we said. When we see that the common source of both ideas of free will and fate is the ego, is having an intent, is the sense of doership. When we see that clearly, then we pass beyond both. We don't need to take recourse to either idea, and things happen as they are meant to happen, which is that they are predestined, and everything happens as predestined, and there is nobody even to blame destiny or to take credit for free will. It just happens. And then it says finally, they've passed beyond both and will not return to them. So then there is no question of going back to either free will or fate, but just simply functioning with clarity in any given situation. The same idea is expressed, of course, in the Gita too, where it's one of my most favorite verses in the 3rd chapter, where Sri Krishna says, all activities are carried out by the 3 modes of material nature, but the ego, due to ignorance, imagines itself to be the doer. So that's exactly this fake sense of doership. He says ahankara vimudhatma. So the ego, due to ignorance, thinks itself to be the self, to be the doer, and imagines therefore that it is the creator of the action and the experiencer of the results, both of which are not true. There is no individual creating any action, and there is no individual experiencing any results. Things happen, and things keep happening, and it's like the ocean. As the waves keep going, life keeps on moving. And if we have the clarity that this intelligence functions precisely on its own, the intelligence we call God, or nature. Here the word used is prakriti, which literally means nature, prakrite kriyamanani. So it means the 3 modes of nature. So nature is another word for power, Shakti, God, whatever the names are many, but the one that is responsible for all actions makes every happening happen. And that clarity alone is the secret to surrender. So that's what this verse in Uladu Narpadu and this Gita verse point to. And finally, there is also this question of, if everything is predetermined, what's the point of even praying? And that's also an interesting question. But there, again, there is a verse in the Gita, which I remember, where Krishna says there are 4 types of devotees who come to me. The first is those who want material things, who pray for wants. The second is those who pray to remove suffering. The third is those who are inquisitive. And the fourth is the jnani, the one who is completely desireless and totally surrendered. Jnani is not to be confused with the word, with scholarliness, as some people tend to mix. Here, what Krishna refers to, and in many other places too, when the word jnani is used, it's used in the sense of someone who has realized, not one who has studied or one who has a lot of scholarly wisdom, but one who has actual realization of this surrender. And therefore, he is also the perfect devotee. That's what Krishna himself says. The dearest devotee is a jnani. So what he says in that verse is the answer to the question, why pray if everything is predetermined? In fact, to realize everything is predetermined and to completely surrender is prayer. One doesn't have to pray separately. One doesn't have to do anything else. That is the highest form of prayer, to realize that everything is predestined, and therefore to be completely surrendered to the divine will. Thy will be done, as they say. That is the highest prayer, to say thy will be done. So that is also another reason to another way to rather realize that being very clear about the non-doership of anything, and therefore not having any resistance to any happening, is true surrender, is true jnana or wisdom, realization. It is not different at all. It is true inquiry. It is also true karma yoga. So we normally think of these as separate things, jnana, bhakti, and karma. But actually, they point in the ultimate sense, even though there may be differences for someone who takes up these things as a practice. But in its truest essence, they are one and the same. Because to realize is to surrender, and to surrender is to work without expectation of results and without a sense of doership.